As a nurse and your storyteller, I want to take a moment to highlight the incredible work of CNAs in the healthcare field. Their job is not only physically demanding, but also emotionally challenging. Imagine having to clean and care for someone who is confused, combative, or even aggressive. It's exhausting work, and yet they often receive the least recognition and pay. So when you visit your loved one, please remember to be respectful and appreciative of the healthcare staff who dedicate themselves to such tough, essential work. In this video, you'll hear the creepy, scary, and even paranormal side of a CNA's job. Turn off the lights, close your eyes, and let these stories unfold in your mind as if you were the CNA experiencing them. A quick warning, some details in these stories may be graphic, so listener discretion is advised. Welcome to LV Scary Stories. Sit back, and I hope you enjoy the tales. Story number 1. Working as a CNA means dealing with the unexpected every day. It's not always glamorous, but I genuinely love caring for my patients. One of my favorites was James, an elderly man with a kind smile and a sharp wit, before his health started to decline. When I first met James, he was pleasant and thoughtful. He used to joke with me, saying, "Sophia, you CNA work the hardest, but they pay you the least. If anyone gives you trouble, you let me know, and I'll handle it." I laughed it off, but his sincerity warmed my heart. That was James before his UTI took over. Once the infection set in, everything changed. He became confused, combative, and agitated. The antibiotics that were supposed to help him caused severe diarrhea. It was a nightmare for him and for me. James was no longer the sweet old man who cracked jokes. He'd scratch me with feces under his nails as I tried to clean him up, screaming and fighting me every step of the way. It wasn't his fault, but it was exhausting. James had 2 daughters. Karen, who lived with him, was an angel. She understood how much James was struggling and appreciated everything we did for him. Karen was there for every appointment and every hard day, seeing firsthand what James went through. When his condition worsened and he became septic, Karen made the difficult decision to put him on hospice and prioritize his comfort. Then there was Susan. She came from out of state and acted as if she knew everything. She was rude, demanding, and quick to blame the nursing staff for anything that went wrong. She had no idea what James endured daily, yet she acted like she cared more than anyone else. Karen tried to reason with her, but Susan was relentless. When James passed away, I was there to help my nurse clean him up. It's a delicate process, and most families give us space to do it. Not Susan. She insisted on staying in the room, watching our every move as if we were doing something wrong. It was uncomfortable, but we continued our work. As we turned James to clean his back, the unimaginable happened. His body released a final, uncontrollable burst of diarrhea. It's not uncommon after death, but this time it shot out directly at Susan, splattering her dress. Susan shrieked, her face a mix of disgust and rage. She stormed out of the room, muttering curses under her breath. Karen, standing just outside the door, looked at me and said quietly, "I guess Dad finally got tired of her attitude." We both managed a small, bittersweet laugh. Once we finished cleaning James and preparing him for the morgue, Susan didn't return that day. She sent a string of angry calls to the nurses' station instead, complaining about everything and anything. It was frustrating, but not surprising. It's always the family members who aren't there day to day who seem to have the most complaints. They don't see the pain, the struggle, or the effort it takes to care for someone in their final days. Karen, on the other hand, thanked us through tears before leaving the hospital. That night, as I sat in my car, I couldn't help but think of James. Somewhere in all that chaos, his old self shone through one last time. I smiled to myself, imagining him laughing from wherever he was, saying, I told you I'd handle it, Sophia. Story number 2. Working as a CNA, you see a lot. Pain, heartbreak, sometimes miracles. But there are nights when the air feels heavier, and the things you witness stay with you forever. That night was one of them. We got the call just after midnight. An ambulance was en route with a young pregnant woman, 3rd trimester, unresponsive. Active chest compressions were in progress, but the tone in the nurse's voice on the other end of the phone told me everything. This wasn't going to end well. Her name was Lisa, 26 years old. She had hung herself. They didn't say it outright at first, but we all pieced it together when the paramedics arrived. Her body was pale, limp, her long brown hair tangled around the oxygen mask they'd strapped on her face. The medics were exhausted from the compressions, but they kept going until we could take over. The ER was chaos. Nurses, doctors, and techs swarmed around her, shouting vitals, asking for equipment, all while someone was on the phone with OB. The goal wasn't just to save her, it was to save the baby. That's why we were there, pushing blood through her body, hoping to keep the fetus alive. I was tasked with chest compressions. I've done it countless times before, but this felt different. Her body didn't fight back. There was no reflex, no twitch of life, just silence, broken only by the machines and the frantic voices of my co-workers. The purpose of chest compression on a dead body is to keep the blood circulating in an attempt to save the baby within. As I leaned into each compression, sweat forming on my forehead, I glanced toward the door. And that's when I saw her. A woman stood there, just outside the room. She looked exactly like Lisa. Same brown hair, same delicate features. Tears streaked her face, and she was sobbing quietly, her shoulders trembling. For a moment I thought, oh my God, she has a twin. It felt like something from a movie, like maybe her sister had rushed here after hearing the news. But then she did something strange. She didn't come into the room. She just stood there, staring at Lisa on the gurney, her sobs muted against the chaos around us. And then she turned and walked away down the hall, disappearing into the fluorescent-lit corridor. "Emily, stay with me here," one of the nurses shouted, snapping me out of my daze. I refocused, pushing harder on Lisa's chest, but the image of that woman stuck with me. After what felt like an eternity, the attending doctor called it. Lisa's body gave up, and the baby had been gone long before that. The room fell silent except for the soft beeping of the machines that we hadn't turned off yet. I stepped back, my arms shaking from exertion, and something else. Fear? Confusion? I didn't know. When Lisa's family arrived an hour later, their grief filled the halls. Her mother collapsed onto a chair, wailing, while her father stood rigid, tears streaming down his face. I stayed back, watching from the corner of the room as the doctor explained what had happened. Then as they were leaving, I found myself drawn to her mother. I gently touched her arm and said, "I'm so sorry for your loss. I thought I saw someone earlier. I didn't want to intrude, but does Lisa have a sister?" The woman looked up at me, her red, swollen eyes narrowing in confusion. "No," she whispered hoarsely. "She was our only child." The words hit me like a punch to the chest. I tried to make sense of it. Who had I seen? Later that night, when I finally got a break, I sat alone in the staff lounge. My hands still trembled as I replayed the events in my mind. That woman at the door, was she real? A figment of my exhaustion? Or was it Lisa herself, saying goodbye, watching over her body and the child she'd carried, even in her final moments? I never got an answer, but I learned why Lisa had done it. The gossip spread quickly. Her boyfriend had cheated on her after she got pregnant. She'd discovered the affair and spiraled into despair. A young life full of promise, a child who never got the chance to breathe, all lost to betrayal and heartbreak. Story number 3. Working as a CNA, you learn to expect the unexpected. Every shift brings its own set of challenges, but the night I'm about to tell you about stands out as one of the strangest in my career. I was working the night shift at the nursing facility, making my usual rounds and checking on the residents. Room 9 had always been a lively spot, thanks to Juan. He was a long-term resident and quite the character, chatty, opinionated, and never shy about voicing his thoughts. Juan was wheelchair-bound after losing both his legs to diabetes, but he never let that slow him down. His roommate Michael, however, had been a quieter presence. Michael had come to us recently for monitoring because of an aortic aneurysm. At only 62, he was younger than most of the residents, but his condition was so risky that no surgeon would touch him. Despite his quieter demeanor, Michael was polite and kind, and he and Juan seemed to get along well enough. That morning, everything changed. During breakfast, Michael sneezed a few times and started complaining of shortness of breath and severe lower back pain. The pain was spreading, and his face looked pale and clammy. The nurse suspected his aneurysm might have burst, and immediately called 911. I helped wheel Michael out to the waiting paramedics, wishing him well as they loaded him into the ambulance. Sadly, later that evening we got the news. Michael hadn't made it. His aneurysm had indeed ruptured, and there was nothing the doctors could do. Juan didn't know any of this yet. He'd been in his own world most of the day, as usual. When I started my shift again at 11 p.m., I found him at the nurse's station, visibly upset. "Kat, you've got to do something about Michael," he said, his voice shaking. "He keeps holding on to my bed and shaking it. I've told him to stop, but he won't listen. Either you move him or you move me." I blinked, taken aback. "Juan, you're the only one in your room now," I said gently. "Michael isn't there anymore." He gave me a disbelieving look, his hands gripping the wheels of his chair. "What are you talking about? He's in there right now, shaking my bed. You think I'm making this up?" I exchanged a glance with the nurse, who nodded at me to try and calm him down. "Juan, I promise you, you're alone in that room. Michael was taken to the hospital this morning." Juan muttered something under his breath and wheeled himself back to his room, still visibly irritated. We hoped that would be the end of it, but around 1 a.m., we heard him shouting from room 9. "Would you please stop it?" I said stop. His voice was loud and firm, echoing down the quiet hallway. The nurse and I rushed to his room, finding him sitting upright in his bed, glaring at the empty bed across from him. "Juan, what's going on?" I asked. "He's at it again," Juan exclaimed, pointing at Michael's empty bed. "He's holding onto my bed and shaking it. I'm telling you, I can't sleep with him doing that." The nurse walked over and inspected the empty bed, trying to reassure him. "Juan, there's no one here. Michael isn't in the room. You're alone." Juan stared at her, his face twisting in frustration. "I know what I saw. He was right there, shaking my bed." The nurse offered him a sleeping pill to help him relax, and after some convincing, he agreed to take it. Once he settled down, the room finally went quiet, and he managed to sleep through the rest of the night. The next morning, as I was wrapping up my shift, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling. Juan had seemed so sure of what he'd seen, and his reaction wasn't like his usual dramatics. I told myself it was probably his imagination playing tricks on him, maybe the grief of losing his roommate, even if he didn't fully realize it yet. Still, I couldn't help but glance back at room 9 before I left for the day, half expecting to see something or someone there. It stayed empty, but the chill that ran down my spine stayed with me for the rest of the day. Story number 4. I'm a caregiver for an elderly lady named Marcia. Marcia is oxygen dependent and lives with her younger sister, Lucy. They're both elderly, but Lucy is a little more independent. They live in a small white house across the street from my husband and me. I often check on them and take them to their doctor's appointments. Marcia is mostly wheelchair-bound and doesn't walk anymore, although she's still able to stand up to transfer from her chair to her bed and vice versa. Lucy, on the other hand, still gets around with a cane. Unfortunately, all it took was one bad fall to change everything, and that's exactly what happened. Lucy had a fall, broke her right hip, and ended up in the hospital for a few weeks. While she was there, Lucy developed pneumonia and died due to complications. After Lucy's funeral, I remember one evening when I went to help Marcia get ready for bed. I assisted her with a bath, helped her into her nightgown, and got her settled in bed. It was around 8 p.m. when I was heading out of the house. As I walked through the living room, I glanced toward the hallway. That's when I saw it, an outline or shadow of Lucy walking with her cane down the hallway. She turned into the room where she used to sleep when she was alive. At that moment, I wasn't scared. I thought it was just my mind replaying what I was used to seeing when Lucy was still alive. One early morning around 6 a.m., I was up with my husband as he got ready for work. I was making coffee and planning breakfast for my kids before they headed to school. Suddenly, I noticed flashing lights through the window. An ambulance was parked across the street in front of Marcia's house. I froze for a moment, shocked. Marcia had seemed fine the night before when I'd helped her to bed. She hadn't called me for help that morning, which was unusual. I quickly went over to see what was happening. By the time I arrived, they were loading Marcia into the ambulance. She was unresponsive but still breathing. I identified myself as her caregiver. That's when one of the responders said something that sent chills down my spine. Someone had dialed 911 from Marcia's house that morning. I stared at them in disbelief. "That's impossible," I said. "Marcia lives alone. Her sister, Lucy, passed away months ago." After that, I went inside Marcia's house. Her cell phone was still on her bedside table. She usually called me with her cell phone whenever she needed help. I unlocked her phone and saw no record of a call to 911. Marcia still had a landline phone in the dining room. When I checked, it was the landline that had called 911 early that morning. For some reason, that sent chills down my spine. Later at the hospital, I learned that Marcia had been receiving too much oxygen, which caused her to become unresponsive. For people with COPD, excessive oxygen can be fatal. It can suppress their drive to breathe and cause them to lose consciousness. If not discovered in time, they could die. The paramedics said the 911 call was what saved her life, but according to the dispatcher, no one had spoken on the other end of the line. All they heard was static. When an officer went to check on the house after the static-filled call, he found Marcia unresponsive and immediately called for an ambulance. After a few days in the hospital, Marcia was discharged to a nursing home, where she spent the remaining 4 months of her life under the care of the nursing staff. Even now, I can't stop thinking about that morning. Who or what dialed 911? Was it just a coincidence? Or was it Lucy? The thought gives me chills every time. It's as if Lucy, even in death, was still watching over her sister, making sure she wasn't alone in her time of need. That wraps up all the stories for this video. As a storyteller and a nurse with over a decade of experience, I've encountered my fair share of strange and possibly paranormal events in this field. Before becoming a nurse, I started as a CNA, working in 3 different nursing facilities where I experienced some truly creepy and unsettling moments. In fact, I've shared one of my own stories in a video titled Real Ghost Stories from an ICU Nurse. You can find it right here on my channel if you're interested. Thank you so much for listening to these stories and for supporting my YouTube channel. I truly appreciate it, and I look forward to sharing more with you in the next video. Until then, Take care and stay curious about the mysteries of the world.